Alright guys, welcome back to Schmattz Outdoors. Sorry this video is coming out a little later than I'd have liked, but this is going to be my 2021-2022 lessons learned video. I'm going to go through a list, most every species I'm trapping. I got a few notes I took on what I want to do differently, things I noticed during the season, some questions people have asked me. So I got my laptop here, I got notes written down so I make sure I hit all the things I want to hit. Alright, so we're going to get going with kind of a few miscellaneous things. I've had people ask me why I talk about the weather so much. So at the beginning of my videos, almost every time, or even at the end of my videos when I do my wrap up for the day, I go over a little bit of what the weather was like that day. Or if in the morning I go over what the weather was like overnight. Majority of your catches are going to be overnight. I am very interested in what the weather's doing because typically if it's super windy, that reduces my catch quite a bit. If it's cloudy or bright skies or all those things, make a little bit of difference or make difference on my catch rate, especially on the canines, so coyotes and fox, badgers to some extent, raccoons and skunks I haven't noticed so much, and muskrats and mink I haven't noticed so much. Typically they're a pretty decent catch rate, but like for muskrats in particular, I feel like you catch, I could be wrong, but I feel like you catch a fair amount of muskrats right like the hour before it gets dark, and the hour, and then overnight, and then the hour after it starts getting light, or maybe a half an hour after it starts getting light, you'll see muskrats still moving around. So I don't think it's quite as important for the weather for those species, but for canines, especially around here, it makes a pretty big difference. And I just want to give you guys, I bring it up every day just because I want to give you guys an idea of what the weather happened to be that night, and then you can kind of compare that to the catches I make that day to kind of see if it makes any difference. The next thing on my list here is my season first this year. I kind of keep track of these things just kind of for the fun of it. So here's just a quick rundown of first for me, and that happened this season, that I've never done before ever. So first thing is I caught 2 mink in one day. I typically only catch like 1, maybe 2 mink a year. So the fact that I caught 2 in a day this year is a pretty big thing for me. Again, I don't think our mink population is super high. There's apparently more than I thought there were, because I ended up catching 6 mink total for the season, which was also a first for me. That's my personal best in the season. My previous was only 3, so I doubled what my previous best was. A first for me is catching a mink on a baited muskrat set. So I got one right here. I just had a carrot on the trigger, and I actually caught 2 mink in a baited 110 with a carrot on the trigger in one day. I don't understand how that happens, why it happened, but it happened. So I ended up, that's a first for me to catch 2 in a day. Happened to be both in the same type of set that are set for muskrats. I don't know why a mink is going to chew on a carrot, but apparently they must have. The next thing is, I am pretty confident I've never caught 2 fox in one day. And I did it several times this season. But I don't think I've ever done that before, because typically, again, I catch like around average 5 fox in a season. So to catch 2 in a day would be, a pretty big feat. But I happened to do it. I think I did it 3 times this season. So the next one is catching 16 fox in a season. My previous best was only 7. I thought it was 8, but I ended up looking back through my records, and my previous best was only 7 fox in one season, and I ended up with 16 this year. I attribute some of that to the coyote numbers being down, which I like to think I did a little bit to do that, with catching 42 of them last season, 42 coyotes. And that was my previous best for coyotes in a season, is 42 that I did last year. But the next one is catching an otter in a beaver set. I've only ever caught 2 otters in my life now. So it's basically anytime I catch an otter, it might be a first for that. I actually caught him in a beaver set, Castor Mountain drowning set. That's a first for me. Only just because I've caught so few otter. The first otter I actually caught in a coyote set. So with gusto as a lure on there. So apparently a little skunky smelling. It was down by the lake, and ended up catching my first otter 4 seasons ago or 5 seasons ago, and then I caught one this year. So there are not a lot of them around, so to catch one, like I said, it's a pretty big deal for me. And then this is kind of a weird thing, and different people have kind of tried to argue with me about this, about remaking badger sets. And then I've never caught a coyote or a fox in a set I've previously caught a badger in until this year. One of the very first catches I had in a coyote set, I caught a badger, and then wasn't only a few days later I ended up catching a coyote, and that set ended up producing a badger first, 2 coyotes, and then a fox right at the end. So that's a first for me, catching a canine in a set I previously caught a badger in. So badger sets, I'll move over 10 feet and put it in a brand new set every time. I will catch canines and stuff in that new set, and I will not catch them in the remake until this year. I had it happen once. And then the last thing, and for me, this is a pretty big thing for me. Some of you guys might think it doesn't matter, don't care about it, but I caught my local Grand Slam of animals this season, plus a bonus fisher that aren't supposed to be in our area. So I'm going to go through the list of the animals I caught this season, and I caught at least one of each one of these species throughout the season here. So a coyote, a fox, a badger, a raccoon, skunk, a muskrat, beaver, a mink, an otter, a weasel, a possum, and then that bonus fisher. So a mix of water animals and land animals, you know, some couple canines in there, fox and coyotes. That's the only species in my part of Minnesota where I trap that are actually here. And then like I said, I caught the bonus fisher, which aren't supposed to be in this area, even though I've caught a few of them. I've caught 3 now over the years. But so that's a first for me to actually complete the whole Grand Slam. A couple times I've been like 1 animal off. You know, the year I caught the otter, I didn't catch a weasel that season. And then I've caught a few seasons I've had the weasels, but just haven't caught an otter until this season. So the last kind of miscellaneous thing that going through and editing the videos, it's very helpful to actually get you kind of out of trapping mode and more into like, let's see what really happened. So by editing all these videos, they're fun for me to make, but they're very educational for me as well. So one thing I noticed is on video 21, episode 21, I showed that I was changing my fox urine. I had used up, you know, I had like 3/4 of a gallon of fox urine left from last season. And I had electrical taped the lid shut and all that. And I used it until the episode 21. I used roughly a 1/2 or 3/4 of a gallon of fox urine. On day 21, I switched to brand new fox urine. From day 22 until the end of the season, it was 10 days. I ended up catching 7 coyotes, a badger, and 8 fox in those last 10 days of my season. So out of perspective, I caught 7 out of the 18 coyotes I caught in the last 10 days after I changed fox urine. I only caught 1 out of 4 badgers, but I caught 3 badgers real early in the season. But I still did catch the 1 badger, and that was in a set I had just put out the previous day. So one day it was there and I caught a badger in it. And then I ended up catching 8 out of the 16 fox in the last 10 days of my trapping season. So I just found it interesting that changing my fox urine, did that make a difference? Because I caught roughly half of my canines in the last 10 days compared to the first 20 some days that I trapped, 21 days or whatever. So I don't know, I may next year, I have about, again, a half a gallon left over again. I may actually, I'm gonna end up probably buying more fox urine because a half gallon won't make me through a whole season. I end up using about a gallon, honestly. I actually think right from the start of the season next year, I'm gonna be using brand new fox urine, and then when I run out of the brand new stuff, I will use the stuff I have. The only thing I was thinking about doing is maybe the first day or, you know, first week I'm setting traps, use the older fox urine because it won't be quite as strong. And you might be able to pick up a few of those, maybe a little trap shy coyotes or fox, that type of stuff. When it starts to get colder out, you know, so again, 10 days, you know, a week or 10 days into the season, switch to the new fox urine because I'm assuming it has a little bit stronger smell, and that's, you know, might have been the difference in, you know, catching those animals not, you know, late in the season with the new urine as opposed to using the older urine. So again, it's just kind of a miscellaneous thing that I happened to notice when I was editing my videos that I just thought was kind of interesting, and I thought you guys might want to know. All right, we're gonna go now species by species. We're gonna start with mink. I have two different mink sets, or two different pole sets with 110s on them, and that's what this is. Nope. So this 110 has a Hags bracket on it, you know, in the spring. So the carrot I was putting just on the, so it says just all I have it with the carrot on the top half of the trigger. I had intentions of actually trying to set my trap like this, or even upside down, so it actually would have been set like this, with my carrot running sideways on the trigger. And I didn't end up doing it. I talked to you about this last year in my lessons learned, and I didn't end up doing it for no reason other than I just kind of forgot about it until I was looking back at my lessons learned list from last year. But so this trap here, like I said, I basically had it set like this every time with my carrot on that top part of that trigger, roughly midway. And then that carrot I had just so the bottom of my carrot was touching the water. A few sloughs, the water kept going up and down a little bit on me, so I ended up keep moving them around, and some of them I would actually, if they were dropping every day, I'd actually put my carrot down in the water almost completely, and then like the next day it'd still be like a half an inch or an inch out of the water. This year I started using a different bracket, so I'll take the trap off and I'll show you what it is. This is a single bracket from Sudden Valley Supply, and I'm not even sure if you can get them anymore or not. I bought them over the summer, and then I talked to the guy at the National Trapping Convention, and it sounded like they were going to get away from making these brackets. They're going to make more of a spring clip, like your bait clips style bracket that holds, so you'd actually have two on each pole to hold it. So this style was set up. I can't turn my trigger because the trap clamps on the spring on this, you know, the bracket. So the trigger has to be running sideways. So your carrot's always going to be running, you know, parallel to the water and sideways in your trap, or however you want to look at that. We'll take this guy off of there, because I have a couple other things with these new brackets. So all I do is I just slip my chain over the top of my pole to put your trap on there. You can kind of see how that thing is orientated. I basically hook it on each side, and then when you squeeze your trap, it squeezes that bracket. And then once you get it, I have them all set so they go on the second notch on my trigger. And all my 110s are all set. Even these are all set up to use the second notch. So I'm not fiddling around with each trap, going one notch, two notches, three notches, depending on the trap. I have every one of them tuned so the second notch is where they got to be. So now with this style of a trap, one of my points that I have on my list here is I had like 3 or 4 muskrats caught in this style of a setup. In the muskrat, this part of the spring would actually hang up my muskrat. When the trap went off, it would hang up on one side or the other of this, and it would actually be like the spring of this would be between the jaw of my trap and the actual muskrat itself. So I don't think they could have even wiggled enough to get it to fall off. That is actually why I like this style of a setup more than this setup. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. I just got a stick here. So if this trap goes off, it can do that, and they will do that. But the way this Hague's bracket works, it will catch just as much as it lets it fall. On this style of a trap, there's nothing actually holding the trap to the pole. So when it goes off, it falls off. Almost every time. Like I said, I had a few hang up this year, but the thing I like about it falling off is if you catch them by like the nose, like I literally had one caught by like the last quarter inch of his nose in one of these traps. Can you see, these Victors shut pretty tight, or I'm pretty sure that's an old Victor, but it drowns them. Where a trap like this, I end up with some muskrats. I feel like I get a few pullouts with these style of traps if it doesn't catch them like behind the head, where this style of a bracket lets them fall off most of the time and drowned. And that's actually what I want. Two things: my animal's out of sight, birds of prey aren't going to be messing with it. Not that I've ever had that happen, but other people driving by can't see your animal there. All right, so that's all I have on brackets like that. The next thing I want to talk about is, so I got Hague's brackets on all my 1.5s I use for muskrat trapping. And then this is a Sun Valley Supply bait clip. And I like them because they're both the same. Two things with this bait clip: you can use them as a bait clip. If your pole starts spinning in the mud, you can actually stick it on upside down, and then these two will stab into the mud, and it actually does help keep your poles from spinning. And I did do that a couple times this season when I was running my line. So I have all my traps. I tuned them and I bent them so they all set. You can see that trap set's pretty level on there. I would actually have the pan down just a little bit more. I like a pretty hair trigger trap when I'm trapping muskrats, so very little pan tension, but I want it so it only moves that far and it's setting off. I typically like a good 1 to 2 inches of water over my trap. One thing I noticed in other years, like 2 seasons ago or last season, I caught 300 muskrats and I had to keep moving my bait up. I mean, I was close to 18 inches out of the water and I still had muskrats chewing on my bait, and sometimes my trap wasn't even set off or knocked off. So my thinking was to keep raising it up, to keep them moving around on my trap to get them to step on the pan and set it off. This season my catch rate was quite a bit slower. You guys seen it. I trapped I think 10 or 11 days or 12 days maybe. I'd have to go back and look. As opposed to last year, I only trapped 7 or 8 days. But I ended up this season, I actually think I had them up too high, because you gotta remember, muskrats swimming around water level, I don't know how much they're really looking up here to see a carrot up there. They may, and I did catch muskrats on these, but I actually think I should have been, and I actually did towards the end, lower my bait clips down, so it's more like 6 or 8 inches above the water. I guess my thinking is now I'd rather sacrifice them chewing on my carrot a little bit than being too high and they don't even see it or smell it. Because I put my lure on my carrot and I use a chunk of a sugar beet, and that's where I put my lure. And I feel like the closer I get that to water level, the better it's going to be, like if an animal swims by, to smell it and be attracted over to it. So I think that's everything. So like I said, I almost think having these lower, maybe 8 inches, 10 inches, I think might be more of a sweet spot. Like I said, I actually started them off like closer to 18 inches, and I think they were just too high. And again, I like the Hague's brackets for these because it does that. I think I've had 2 or 3 I've had one that's been still alive in one of these where the trap actually hung up in the bracket and didn't drown them. I do get ones once in a while where they hang up and they'll be dead hanging there, but almost every time they're sitting on the bottom of the slough drowned. And again, that's what I want. I want them out of sight, out of mind. The next little thing I want to make a point of is moving your sets. A couple times this season, I noticed I was using 2 sets at each spot this year, 1 foothold and 1 baited 110. Every place I had 2 traps there. And I noticed a few times that, oh, so let's stick on that just for a second here. The reason why I did that is last season, I had traps, I was catching muskrat over and over again. Some of them was like 4, 5, 6 days in a row I caught a muskrat in the trap. But I only had 1 trap there. So my thinking was this year, I didn't know how long I was gonna be able to trap because you never know when it's gonna freeze up. So my thinking was I'm gonna put 2 traps in every spot, and with the idea that you might catch 2 muskrats every day. And this year it was slow. I only did it a couple times where I had 2 traps and I caught a muskrat in each one. But I think muskrat numbers were quite down because we had a pretty bad drought basically from beginning of May all the way to the end of July. We got like 0 rain. So some of the Saults even went completely dry last year. And I think that hurt our muskrat population pretty badly. But so that was my thinking behind having 2 sets at every location. Back to moving them. I did have a couple times where like I had my trap set in there, and when I'd pull up, there'd be muskrats swimming like 10 feet away. Like multiple days in a row I seen this. I ended up moving my traps over to where the muskrats were swimming, and then like the next day I had muskrats caught. For some reason it was just like that 10 feet even, that it was, you know, down the shoreline or whatever, and they just weren't traveling over there, or they're avoiding that area for some reason. Sometimes I wonder if it ends up being like in the middle of 2 muskrats territories, you know, and they kind of, you're in the gray zone between them, and neither one wants to enter that area. So by moving it one way or the other, you get into one muskrat's territory and out of the other one or whatever. And sometimes, you know, I think that does help as well. But like I said, if you see muskrats swimming around and you're not catching them, move your traps to where the muskrats are at. You know, like I said, I ended up catching several muskrats in sets that I did that. Like the next day, as soon as I moved it, the next day I had catches. So, all right, the next thing I have, and this was on my list last year. I did better at it this year, but there were still a few times. If a trap, especially some of these 110s, if it's set off like 2 days in a row or more, I should have been yanking those traps out of there and putting clean trap or a fresh trap in there. You know, the trigger might have just had a little bit of, you know, dye in them, because I did dye all my muskrat, or speed dipped all my traps last season. All right, the next thing I want to talk about here is floats and a floating colony trap. So I built a prototype. Basically, I kind of come up with the design by myself off of, you know, looking at a few pictures of floating colony traps of what I could see. I did not catch a single muskrat in my floating colony trap. The one thing I noticed that it's different from mine than what some of the pictures I had seen, the ones I had seen, people had actually covered the top of their floating colony trap. So the only entrance on the end was open, otherwise it was covered. And I don't know if that gives the muskrat a little more confidence of going in there, or why that would make a difference, but apparently, like I said, my setup did not work. But one thing I noticed is I have my board in the underside of like where the muskrats would drown in my colony trap is a couple inches longer on each end than so I figured they could crawl up and then crawl in. Well, yeah, they were crawling up and then they were pooping on my floating colony trap. And I had good intentions last summer of making me some floats. I have a design already figured out. I have some boards already for doing it. I just never got around to doing it last summer. So before the season, this upcoming season here, I'm hoping maybe a 10 or a dozen floats set up, and I'm gonna do, you know, 2 1.5s on each side. I'm gonna router a profile in so they set kind of down in and flush in my board. And then probably use, you know, make them a baited set. So pile on a little bit of grass or whatever, but put like a chunk of sugar beet, a carrot or 2 on there, whatever, to bait them. So like I said, we're going to have some floats before next season's for muskrats. Not every place floats are going to work, but there are some spots where I think floats will work very nicely. So we're going to give that a shot next year. if they don't work, I'm out a little bit of time and some wood for doing it. And like I said, it won't actually be that much time, I don't think. Once I get one built, they all should, you know, then I kind of get the idea. They should go pretty quick after that. All right, I've had the last thing on muskrats. I've had a few people ask me why I use almost all baited sets and very few like actual blind sets. You know, I put some colony traps and culverts, which is, you know, a blind set or whatever. I do not walk around sloughs to trap muskrats. In my area here, we're kind of in the prairie pothole region, they call it. There is plenty of sloughs. I'm trapping just in the road ditch. So I'm no more than, you know, 15 feet from the road when I'm putting my set in. Because I'm doing that, I'm not taking the time to try and find runs where they're going into the bank. I'm not monkeying around with their houses, you know, open water. Last season I did do some, you know, hut trapping after it iced up. But, you know, and that's a completely different setup. And that would be like a blind set inside the house. But I don't have to spend all my time doing that. I basically am just trapping right in the road ditch, so I'm only trapping a small portion of each slough. And that brings up kind of another point too, is that people have asked me, you know, that I'm going to trap out a slough. It may happen. I'm not going to say I'd never do it, but I'm only trapping, you know, 5% of a lot of these sloughs. I mean, some of them are, you know, tens of acres of water, and I'm only trapping a few sets along the road. You know, all the muskrats on the whole other side of the slough. I'm not saying that they don't travel around and, you know, you might catch a few of them, but there's plenty of the sloughs that I'm not trapping, that I'm not worried about over trapping. And I'm also using baited and lured sets because I'm hoping that the wind catches my lure and will bring in some muskrats that are, you know, that aren't right along the road. The second thing is a little bit about that is a fair amount of muskrats in my area actually use bank dens and not huts. You know, up until the last couple of years, you hardly ever seen a hut in a slough. They were all living in the roads, in the road bank. They dig holes up into the road banks because the roads are, you know, built up high enough they can live like in the shoulder of the road essentially. So by me trapping just along the road, you know, using baited sets, lured sets, I feel like that gives me the best opportunity to catch, you know, as many muskrats as I can, as quickly as I can. There are times where a blind set will work. I mean, I had one instance where I had found a hole kind of going down where the muskrats had plugged up the end of the culvert, and there was a hole going into the culvert, and I put a 110 in front of that, and I ended up catching 2 big muskrats out of that set. You know, within, I think that might have been either the first or the second day after I put it there, I caught one, and then a couple days later I caught one again. And those muskrats had swam by my baited sets, and then I caught them in that blind set. So do baited sets catch every muskrat out there? No. Will floats do it? No. You know, there's no set that's 100% that's going to catch every muskrat or any animal for that matter. But yeah, so I focus on right in the road ditches, and I use baited sets with lure on them to try and bring muskrats to my sets, more so than trying to get them exactly on, you know, right next to the huts and that thing. If there's a hut there, don't get me wrong, I'll put my set right in front of the hut, but I don't go out of my way spending hours at every slough trying to find runs going up into the bank. A lot of these sloughs, there are carp in some of these sloughs and the bigger ones. The water's muddy, you can't see the runs anyway, so you'd have to step in the run to find them a lot of times. So baited sets, like I said, there are times where they work very well. They actually maybe work better than baited sets. I just don't have the time to try and find where to put all my blind sets.